The Real History of Slavery in America. The 13 Experiments. In early America, the original colonies were a creation of the British Empire. On social media, there is a list of black people rumored to have altered the history of enslavement, and Anthony Johnson was the most prominent. The rumor is he was the first black man to arrive in Virginia and the first black indentured servant in America. In 1635 Johnson was freed and given a 250-acre plantation where he was master over both black and white servants. In 1654 Johnson sued his neighbor in a case that would change America's history forever. Or that is what some people want you to believe. Johnson's servant, John Casser, claimed he was an indentured servant, also a black man, who had worked several years past the terms of his indenture for Johnson and was now working for Johnson's neighbor, Parker. Johnson sued Parker, stated that Casser was his servant in perpetuity, and the courts ruled in his favor. What if it was all propaganda to shift blame? Jurisdiction at the time was Great Britain. King James I changed the status of Virginia in 1624. Virginia was a royal colony administered by a governor appointed by the king himself. However, according to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, it was the early 1620s when the East India Company began transporting slave labor to and using it in its facilities across Asia and the Atlantic. The company received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I on the 31st of December 1600. So suggesting that Anthony Johnson was responsible for the demise of black slavery in the American colonies is absurd. In June 1772, Lord Mansfield, Chief Justice of the King's Bench, held that slavery is so odious, that nothing can be suffered to support it, but positive law. As the law of England, neither allowed, nor approved, of slavery, Mansfield ruled that the black must be discharged. Mansfield's decision outlawed slavery only in England, it did not apply to British colonies. But that was immaterial to American slaves. In January 1773, the General Court in Boston received the first of 3 petitions in which slaves pleaded their freedom with the argument that Mansfield's decision should apply to the colonies, where they were held in a state of slavery within a free and Christian country. When tensions between John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, known as Lord Dunmore, and Virginia's ruling elite increased in early 1775, the ground was well prepared for his lordship to arm all my own Negroes and receive all others that will come to me who I shall declare free, as he wrote to Dartmouth on March 1. Dunmore could argue that since the colonists were clamoring for English law, they could get a taste of it. The gunpowder incident occurred on April 20, 1775, in Williamsburg, Virginia, when the British Army under Lord Dunmore advanced to confiscate gunpowder stores. Just as in Lexington and Concord the colonial militia began to muster when they heard of Dunmore's movements. Patrick Henry led his militia to confront the British. In the end, the conflict was resolved peacefully when Dunmore paid £330 for the ammunition. After resolving the conflict, Lord Dunmore removed himself from Virginia for fear of his life. Forced to pay restitution for the powder, Dunmore lost his temper in front of the town leaders. Williamsburg resident Dr. William Pasteur heard the governor say that he would declare freedom to the slaves and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes. He boasted he would have all the slaves on the side of the government. In late spring of 1776, Lord Dunmore and the last royal governor of Virginia encamped his forces on Gwyn's Island. Earlier that month, at least 800 blacks willing to bear arms had joined Dunmore's force, now quartered on Gwyn's Island. When he left Virginia for good on August 7, only about 300 were still alive, all others had died of fevers. Once Dunmore had cast anchor in New York 7 days later, the regiment was dissolved, and the former soldiers left to fend for themselves. Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence in the morning of a bright, sunny, but cool Philadelphia day. John Dunlap prints the Declaration of Independence. Up till the 4th of July 1776 all the atrocities against the blacks and the whites who were indentured servants, the British Empire will have to take responsibility. Going forward the 13 colonies will be judged on the basis that all men are created equally. In the colonies, were opinions about slavery in several forms. Infused with economic, social, religious, moral, and practical dimensions, this was a battle fought in the halls of colonial legislatures and even within families. Anti-slavery currents ran through every region of British North America. There was opposition to an anti-slavery clause in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. According to Thomas Jefferson, the clause was opposed by South Carolina and Georgia, plus unspecified Northern brethren, probably Rhode Island. The triangular trade was slaves produced sugar and molasses in the Caribbean sent to Rhode Island and made into rum. They exported the rum to West Africa in exchange for slaves who then transferred to the West Indies to produce more sugar. Before the days of reciprocity agreements, they could evade taxes with the 1733 Molasses Act, which placed a tax of 6 pence per gallon. The cost of either paying the exorbitant tax or buying molasses at a much higher rate from the British West Indies would have been ruinous to the New England rum distilleries. But the Sugar Act 1764, which placed a tax of 3 pence per gallon when rum sold at 12 pence per gallon. This time they enforced it with seizing ships and cargo. Rhode Island was preparing to conduct a naval war on the British Royal Navy 10 years before the American Revolution. On May 4, 1776, the General Assembly of the Colony of Rhode Island declared its absolute independence from Great Britain. The members voted nearly unanimously, thus making Rhode Island the first independent sovereign state in the Western world. There were many compromises in the beginning because of the impending war with Great Britain. We must indeed all hang together, or, most assuredly, we shall all hang separately, said Benjamin Franklin. As the war bore on, the necessity of more troops became evident, and again slaves provided the opportunity for their freedom in exchange for their services. Before the American Revolution, the English worried about the Spanish who controlled Florida. They wanted to create Georgia as a buffer colony, to protect South Carolina, because it had a lot of recourses. Without slaves, their economy would plummet. South Carolina and Georgia grew mostly indigo, rice, and sugar. Georgia made most of its money off of these three cash crops. John Laurens as a lieutenant colonel, Congress approved a plan to turn to South Carolina and Georgia for the enlistment of 3,000 slaves, who would be requisitioned proportionally according to the size of each slave owner's holdings. Loyal service would entitle the slaves to their freedom and $50 at war's end. Men of color to arms. To arms. Now or never, this is our golden moment. The government of the United States calls for every able-bodied colored man to enter the Army for the 3 years' service, and join in fighting the battles of liberty and the Union. A new era is open to us. For generations, we have suffered under the horrors of slavery, outrage, and wrong. Our manhood has been denied, our citizenship blotted out, our souls seared and burned, our spirits cowed and crushed, and the hopes of the future of our race involved in doubt and darkness. But now our relations to the white race are changed. Now, therefore, is our most precious moment. Let us rush to arms. Fail now, and our race is doomed on this the soil of our birth. We must now awake, arise, or be forever fallen. If we value liberty, if we wish to be free in this land, if we love our country, if we love our families, our children, our home, we must strike now while the country calls. We must rise up in the dignity of our manhood, and show by our own right arms that we are worthy to be freemen. Our enemies have made the country believe that we are craven cowards, without soul, without manhood, without the spirit of soldiers. Shall we die with this stigma resting upon our graves? Shall we leave this inheritance of shame to our children? No. 1,000 times no. We will rise. The alternative is upon us. Let us rather die freemen than live to be slaves. What is life without liberty? We say that we have manhood, now is the time to prove it. A nation or a people that cannot fight may be pitied, but cannot be respected. If we would be regarded men, if we would forever silence the tongue of calumny. General Joseph Smith would run for president on an independent platform. The campaign started in Nauvoo in February of 1844. At the time, He was serving as mayor of Nauvoo, a city that was larger and growing faster than most U.S. cities, including nearby Chicago. Historian Richard Bushman argues that Smith started out as a protest candidate but then began to suspect that victory might be attainable. Smith wrote in his journal, "There is oratory enough in the church to carry me into the presidential chair on the first slide, and when I look into the Eastern papers and see how popular I am afraid I shall be president." General Joseph Smith, leader of the Reform Party in the 1844 presidential campaign, there were 13 free states and 13 slave states. Smith proposed the abolition of slavery by the year 1850 through compensated emancipation funded with revenue from the sale of public lands, and with the savings from cutting the salaries of members of the United States Congress from $8 per day to $2 per day. The United States presidential election of that year, scheduled for the 1st of November to the 4th of December, unfortunately, General Smith, assassinated in Carthage, Illinois, on the 27th of June 1844, stopped the movement. Abraham Lincoln reached a national audience in the 1858 debates against Stephen Douglas. Lincoln ran for president in 1860, sweeping the North in victory. Major Robert Anderson, commander of the Union's Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, sent a request for provisions to Washington, and Lincoln's order to meet that request was seen by the secessionists as an act of war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Union troops at Fort Sumter and began the fight. By this time there were now 19 free states who were mandated by the election of Lincoln for the abolition of slavery. There were only 15 slave states. Technically the Civil War was a white man war with exception of black sailors enlisted into the U.S. Navy from the beginning. By the time October 1862, 180,000 African Americans, comprising 163 units, served in the U.S. Army, and around 29,000 in the Navy. Black soldiers made up 10% of the Union Army and had suffered over 10,000 casualties. 3/5 of all black troops were former slaves. Approximately 620,000 soldiers died from combat, accident, starvation, and disease during the Civil War. Also, about 40,000 Canadians and the Maritimes served in the war, mostly supporting the North. At the beginning of the war, the northern states had a combined population of 22 million people. The southern states had a combined population of about 9 million. This disparity was reflected in the size of the armies in the field. The Union forces outnumbered the Confederates roughly 2 to 1. The Civil War would have been finished quickly had there not been interference from the outside, internationally. During the Civil War, blockade runners brought supplies from England: 1,507,000 pounds of lead, 1,933,000 pounds of saltpeter, 69,000 rifles, and 43 cannon reached the Confederates through the port of Wilmington alone. This prolonged the Civil War and slavery, and it cost more casualties on both sides because the English didn't remain neutral like they publicly announced. Great Britain had not only assisted the Confederacy from 1861 to 1865 but had joined in a conspiracy with France, Spain, and Austria to divide North America between them. On October 31, 1861, it held a convention in London attended by delegates from England, France, and Spain. They agreed to a joint intervention in Mexican affairs. Emperor Maximilian, brother of Franz Joseph of Austria, was to go on the throne of Mexico. Louisiana, which extended at the time from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico, would go to France. The northern states were to overrun and return to England as colonies. The Confederacy was to be free and keep their slaves. All the accomplishments and institutions in the United States in the Revolutionary War, a republic of religious freedoms, the Bill of Rights, taxation with representation would be lost in the history books and set world civilization back to 1775, and slavery would reign without remedy or redress. Britain was supporting something illegal in its own country and sent 14,000 combat troops to Canada, and France, Spain, and Austria were accomplices. Canada was a staging area for the British military. On August 6, 1861, fugitive slaves were declared to be contraband of war if their labor had been used to aid the Confederacy in any way. And if found to be contraband, they were declared free. One controversy that occurred between the Union and Great Britain was the building of Confederacy warships at a British shipyard. The Union was very opposed to this, and after the war, they received $15.5 million in arbitration for the damage caused by the two warships. Tsar Alexander II had been on the throne in Russia for 5 years. He introduced reform to abolish serfdom throughout the Russian Empire of 23 million serfs, which is a polite way of saying 23 million white slaves. He maneuvered the administration of the 1861 Emancipation Manifesto without a civil war. Still smarting from the Crimean War 1854 to 1856, the Tsar, to disrupt the scheme of the European allies, sent his powerful Baltic Squadron to New York Harbor and his Pacific Squadron to San Francisco. His action had the desired effect. Great Britain and Spain withdrew their fleets from Vera Cruz, leaving the burden of supporting Emperor Maximilian entirely to France. Several governments in Europe were considering recognizing the Confederacy and intervening against the Union. If Lincoln declared this a war to free the slaves, the deep state was alive and well back in 1861. If it were up to the European public, they would overwhelmingly back the North. In the United States, this was a white man war and they were the majority. They didn't want their white privilege. They were patriots who wanted to follow the spirit of the Constitution. They wanted to follow the words of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The suffering of the slaves made many in the North miserable with the constant turmoil in their communities and families. Drew Gilpin Faust argued, more Americans died in the Civil War than in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II and the Korean War combined. 2% of the United States population, the equivalent of 6 million today, perished during a conflict many originally thought would be resolved in a matter of weeks. It's interesting to note, even with the outside interference, President Lincoln and the Union Army did not back down. If they felt anything different, don't you think they would give up their resolve? J. David Hacker, a demographic historian from Binghamton University in New York, has recalculated the death toll and increased it by more than 20% to 750,000 and may have been as high as 850,000. With this new information means more military casualties in the Civil War than all other wars in the history of the USA combined. Gulf War and War on Terror included. The goal of the war was to free around 4 million black slaves at the expense of some 750,000 white casualties. When Lincoln won the Civil War, he warned France in very explicit terms that the United States would not tolerate a French force or the existence of any foreign monarchy in Mexico. On January 14, 1866, Napoleon III ordered his general in Mexico to withdraw the troops. In a 4.5-hour speech in Ottawa, Canada, the Honorable John A. Macdonald told the House that a representative in the United States warned him that if they could not agree on satisfactory terms of the Treaty of Washington, it meant war between the United States and Great Britain. In that event, it would invade Canada. To appease President Lincoln, Macdonald proceeded speedily to convince the provinces of Canada to create a federal union and reminded their neighbors to the south between 33,000 and 55,000 men from provinces of Canada served in the war, practically all of them supporting for Union forces. Canada West, now province of Ontario, had recently become part of the Underground Railway from the northern states over the Ohio River and into Canada across Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, en route to various settlements and towns. Reparations for slavery fiercely debated in the United States since the days of Union Army General William Tecumseh Sherman. He promised 40 acres and a mule to the 4 million freed slaves in 1865. They argue a meaningful program to eliminate the disparity of the black and white wealth difference calls for an appropriation of between $10 to $12 trillion, or about $800,000 to each eligible black family. The national debt is already now up to around $26 to $27 trillion given the money we are spending on COVID-19, and we're losing more money because we're not picking up the revenue as economic growth is slow right now. This hardly seems the time to burden the economy with more debt, more taxes. Essentially what you want to do is stimulate economic growth for all our benefits. The immediate problem is there are 40 million slaves worldwide. How many slaves do you own? Today, millions of laborers make your clothes, food, and electronics, and hidden halfway around the world. Children pick cotton for your shirts. Cotton is in 40% of all textiles, and it enslaves people at every stage of the industry, from germination, harvesting, spinning, to manufacturing the clothes. Brazilian men harvest your sugar cane. Children mine cobalt, which in every lithium-ion rechargeable battery, which means if you purchased smartphones or tablets, your laptops to electric vehicles. They also use it in superalloys to manufacture jet engines, gas turbines, and magnetic steel. You can associate slavery to potato chips, ice cream, and lipstick through palm oil production. The palm oil's business uses about 3.5 million slave victims. Forced labor is big business, with profits estimated at $150 billion. If you want to calculate how many slaves you own, see the description in this video. I found out I have 22 slaves working for me. Unfortunately, corporations don't monitor their supply chain to remove the atrocious conditions. Slavery is not a crime in almost half the countries of the world. Legal ownership of people ended in all countries over the course of the last 2 centuries. But in many countries, it is not criminal. In 94 countries, there is no prosecution and punishment in a criminal court for enslaving another human being. When you import products made in sweatshops, you place domestic USA businesses in jeopardy. For products imported into the USA, for example, from Vietnam, the cost of living for the citizens is about $535 a month. They could make $20 a day to live comfortably. Or $2.60 an hour. Compare that to $13 an hour, which I assume is a living wage in the USA, but it might be higher in some places. This is a generic spreadsheet for a factory. $13 an hour is an example of the costs associated with the labor of raw materials and the total manufacturing costs in the USA. The same identical spreadsheets with only the wages changed for Vietnam, and the total manufacturing costs are $216,820. $435,220 the USA costs, minus $216,820 the Vietnam costs equal $218,400. The savings of $218,400 minus the costs of shipping to the marketplace, let's say $18,400, leaves $200,000 in savings in manufacturing costs in Vietnam. The wholesale price of the widgets will be lower than those produced in the USA. Things like this happen all the time. What would the savings be if it is slave labor? If the government does nothing to respond, then Americans will lose businesses and jobs, and by all indications, it has already happened. Almost everyone knows there is a direct correlation between unemployment and crime. As lawlessness goes up, so does hostility between civilians and law enforcement. No one enjoys the fact that there are ghettos, people just don't know how to fix it. So how is the government supposed to respond? Trump put retaliatory tariffs on China, 15% tariffs on $120 billion of Chinese imports, but left 25% tariffs on $250 billion of imports in place. Trump had the money for a $16 billion aid package for farmers who were targeted by China. If the government is aggressive against slavery with tariffs, it can bring money to the Black Platinum Plan and protect domestic businesses and jobs. President Trump has a new $500 billion Platinum Plan for Black economic empowerment. According to the president, the plan will help create 500,000 new Black-owned businesses and 3 million new jobs in African American communities. It might be a good idea to help the indigenous people as well. We must remember that white people on November 4, 2008, supported Barack Obama, who was elected the 44th President of the United States, winning more votes than any candidate in history. On November 6, 2012, Obama was re-elected with 332 electoral votes. It requires white people to support Obama for him to win. In the presidential race on the Republican side, who were portrayed by some as racist, Dr. Ben Carson was in a statistical tie with Donald Trump during the primaries. However, it was the media that attacked Carson, not the people. In the last 4 years, people are more wise to the antics of mainstream media. I did the research because I have ancestors who were slaves for going to the wrong church, and a few were slaveholders from Virginia during the Revolutionary War. Although the deeds of a few were wrong, the corrections of many brought justice and made the world a better place. In revealing antiquated traditions and the clarification of liberty, many followed America's lead. So I examined the facts, and I can see there are many good people in the world who understood the problems and used every mechanism to right the course. With the extreme difficulties placed before them, they overcame, and they realized their noblest triumphs. Almost in every scenario in the snapshot in time, overwhelming the consensus of citizens was they should ban slavery. Why the disconnect with the people and government? Perhaps what America has, a government of the people for the people, is what the doctor ordered. There are no greener pastures around the world. It requires that you must know your history and guard it against those who misrepresent it to carry out their own hidden agenda.